without a sensing life is passing by. So if you want a solution, my friend.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. This evening we're going to be talking about public school versus Islamic school, and in the studio we have our old friend Tahir Khalid. Assalamu alaikum, Tahir. And on the line we have Sister Mona. Assalamu alaikum, sister.
Wa alaikum salam, brother. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. You're very much experienced with schools both in America and in other countries. Would you like to give us a little bit of your expert knowledge to do with the Islamic school versus the private school?
Well, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I don't know how expert it is, but I'll share with you experiences that I have had and observations that I have made over about a 30-year period.
Wow, that should do well.
As it relates to the main goal of parents choosing Islamic schools, number one, it's a big sacrifice that they make. I've seen parents work 2 and 3 jobs in order to pay the tuition and fee to send their child to an Islamic school.
Wow.
Their belief when they send a child to an Islamic or a Muslim school is that the children will be insulated from society, not
from the
isolated,
ills of society,
but insulated. In other words, that they will be taught the things that they need in order to be successful in this world and the hereafter, but that it will be taught by caring Muslims who will present things in such a way that the child has an advantage. For an example, if children are learning about human growth and development in a public secular school, they're going to learn it in a way that a Muslim family would not necessarily want their child to learn this information.
of course.
However, in an Islamic school setting, or a Muslim school setting, as we sometimes call it in the U.S., you have caring teachers who are practicing Islam.
Yeah.
And they know that, yes, things are mentioned in the Quran, for example, in Surah Nur, when it talks about certain crimes. But we know that children are not able to understand these things at certain ages.
Yes.
So you teach them these things in an age-appropriate manner and in a manner that is not perverted, as it frequently is in secularist schools.
Yes, that's very clear. So the children whose parents make these sacrifices, these financial sacrifices, do actually benefit from it, right?
Absolutely. You may have parents, for example, who have reverted to Islam.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a limited knowledge base there.
Right.
On what they, can provide for their children. So they take the old adage of it takes a whole village to raise a Muslim child. Mm-hmm. And a part of this village is the Muslim educational community. Mm-hmm. And so they feel that the sacrifice is well worth it.
Good.
If you were to make a comparative analysis between, you've had a lot of students over the years, between the student who went to a public school or a secular school and went to an Islamic school, let's say by the time they graduate from high school, let's use that first, what would you say the difference would be? And then let's take it a step further. If they graduated from college, what would you say the difference would be between the two students, generally?
Okay. Well, fortunately, I get to see this. I see little kids that I once taught who were 6, 7, and 8, and they come and bring their children to me, and I try to remember who is this person. But when I go back to America, especially because I've seen a couple of generations now, the child who has had an education at a Muslim school or an Islamic school, whatever you wish to call it, and we could talk about that for hours, but if they've had that type of schooling coupled with good home support, in other words, parents are partners with the school,
Yes.
then I see success story. The kid may not be a rocket scientist. I'm not using that as a measure for success.
Yeah. No, nor
but
do we.
by success, I mean children who are practicing their deen and they're contributing members of society.
Okay.
And when you see them physically, you see a Muslim. Okay. I've seen a lot. I've seen quite a bit of this. It's pretty common when you have good, well-grounded Islamic schools where you have this homeschool partnership, a strong homeschool partnership.
So it's a successful formula.
That's what you see 90% of the time.
What I wanted to ask you, sister, was that we know that as individual Muslims, the shaitan is always trying to get at us.
Yes.
Is it conceivable that the Muslim schools are also assaulted by the vices that the public schools suffer from, that these things try and enter the school and steps have to be taken to eradicate it? For example, drugs.
Well, I was at a school in California maybe about 10 years ago, and the first time I ever saw crack cocaine was on a playground at a Muslim school.
Wow.
And it wasn't that the Muslim children had put it there, but it was this particular school was in a economically deprived area.
Yeah.
And when the school would be closed, people would use it in the evening for various
I see. Yes.
things of that nature. And I was very impressed by the way the staff would come before the children would get there, and they would survey the campus to keep the children safe. Now, that's a good example of insulating the children. If you could see such a neighborhood, but then you saw the people who maybe they had just finished working all night, and before they went home, they would comb the campus to make sure that it was a safe environment for their children. So as far as, the shaitan getting in, yes, he does. While the kids are at home sleeping, in a situation like that, the shaitan is very busy. Now, when we're talking about inside, when he's working amongst the Muslims and whispering things to the Muslim kids and the adults who work there, yeah, that's prevalent at every school I've ever been at.
Right.
Yes, sister, if, for example, nowadays in the Muslim countries, particularly in the Khalid, the Gulf states, we have a number of English schools which are following the governmental, you can say, curriculum, but they call themselves Islamically based, whatever that may mean. So how would you see that, comparatively speaking, to what you call Islamic schools or Muslim schools in the West?
Well, quite frankly, I see them as very similar. When I was in the U.S., I was involved with Islamic schools or Muslim schools in North America, period. And basically what would be done, the national curriculum or the various state curriculum would be used. And then Islamic studies, Arabic, Quran would be taught. And then the secular curriculum would be Islamized, so to speak. For example, elements that were un-Islamic would be taken out. Areas that were neutral would be infused with Islamic values. And that's pretty much what I see here also.
It seems like a safe formula, doesn't it?
Until Muslim schools begin to develop standards, okay? And there's a drive to do that now, an international drive. There's a group out of South Africa that started that, but because of funding, they sort of had to put it on the back burner.
Sister, we'll discuss this in more detail when we get back from the break. Thank you. So we're going to take a short break. You're watching Raising Children, the Islamic program about family values and children. And we'll be back soon. Assalamu alaikum.
Like every sunrise that brings forth each day.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome back. What I wanted to ask you, sister, was that we know that as individual Muslims, the shaitan is always trying to get at us.
Yes.
Is it conceivable that the Muslim schools are also assaulted by the vices that the public schools suffer from, that these things try and enter the school and steps have to be taken to eradicate it? For example, drugs.
Well, I was at a school in California maybe about 10 years ago, and the first time I ever saw crack cocaine was on a playground at a Muslim school, and it wasn't that the Muslim children had put it there, but it was this particular school was in a economically deprived area.
Yeah.
And when the school would be closed, people would use it in the evening for various things of that nature.
Mm.
And I was very impressed by the way the staff would come before the children would get there, and they would survey the campus to keep the children safe. Now, that's a good example of insulating the children. If you could see such a neighborhood, but then you saw the people who maybe they had just finished working all night, and before they went home, they would comb the campus to make sure that it was a safe environment for their children. So as far as, the shaitan getting in, yes, he does. While the kids are at home sleeping, in a situation like that, the shaitan is very busy. Now, when we're talking about inside, when he's working amongst the Muslims and whispering things to the Muslim kids and the adults who work there, yeah, that's prevalent at every school I've ever been at.
Right.
Yes, sister, if, for example, nowadays in the Muslim countries, particularly in the Khalid, the Gulf states, we have a number of English schools which are following the governmental, you can say, curriculum, but they call themselves Islamically based, whatever that may mean. So how would you see that comparatively speaking to what you call Islamic schools or Muslim schools in the West?
Well, quite frankly, I see them as very similar. When I was in the U.S., I was involved with Islamic schools or Muslim schools in North America, period. And basically what would be done, the national curriculum or the various state curriculum would be used. And then Islamic studies, Arabic, Quran would be taught. And then the secular curriculum would be Islamized, so to speak. For example, elements that were un-Islamic would be taken out. Areas that were neutral would be infused with Islamic values. And that's pretty much what I see here also.
It seems like a safe formula, doesn't it?
Until Muslim schools begin to develop standards, okay? And there's a drive to do that now, an international drive. There's a group out of South Africa that started that, but because of funding, they sort of had to put it on the back burner.
So this South African group, they've been setting standards for education. Are they Christian-based, or what's their philosophy?
No, they're Muslims.
Oh, they're Muslims, I see, right.
And they've
now it's clear.
Been here, I guess maybe about 4 or 5 years ago. They were in the UAE trying to share this vision. In the U.S., they, around 1998, 97, somewhere around that time, they were in the U.S. trying to share that vision because it's very much needed. You have to have standards. You can't just pick up a textbook and say, I'm going to teach this child.
Mm-hmm.
And so they were the forerunners. Now there are other groups who are trying to do the same, and that, as far as developing standards for, what children should learn.
Right. This South African group, are they the South African Indians, the Gujaratis, or are they a mixed Muslim bunch?
I have to say that when I met them, in education you tend to be a little bit colorblind. So I really don't know.
Right.
It was a group of brothers who were very involved in it, but I really couldn't tell you about the ethnicity.
Okay, right.
Okay, can I ask you a question, again, coming back to when we're talking about education, the Islamic schools, which are basically English-speaking schools in the Gulf states. How would you compare them to the government schools? Have you had any contact with the government schools who are generally Arabic-based? But if you were to compare the Islamic learning, if you're aware, I don't know how much you know about the Arabic system, but if you are aware of it, how would you compare the standard of the English Islamic schools to the government school?
Well, the government schools, and may Allah continue to help them with this, they are experiencing reform now, and that's a wonderful thing.
Okay.
As far as improving standards, improving standards for teaching, standards for learning, and so they're making headway with that. I traveled with a group of them last spring, and the goal of these particular principles was to learn best practices in school leadership. So that's a good thing. As far as how do they compare with the private schools, of course you have some private schools that are very cutting edge and very progressive. And then you have some private schools, of course, that are struggling. But the thing that I admire the most, as far as all of the schools are concerned, is that they really want to, the schools that say that they're Islamic-based, okay, these private schools, there is a sincerity there to develop a Muslim child who really will be successful in this world and the hereafter. Now, there are many roads to excellence. Everyone doesn't choose the same road. Different curricula are used. For example, you may have some using the American curriculum, some using the British curriculum, the Australian curriculum, the Montessori, you name it, just as diverse as the culture is, with all of the people here, you see that same diversity in the education.
So what would you say, though, when you talk about these private schools? When we say private schools in the West, that's usually an exclusive school. It's usually an expensive school. And people, of course, when they're paying for their children to go to school, they expect really the top-notch education. So if you're saying that these Islamic schools are private schools, how do they match up to what you're saying, the cutting-edge schools, or would you say they're among the cutting-edge schools?
Well, you have some private schools, as I said, that are very, very good. The fees, of course, reflect what the children get there. You're not going to be able to have a top-notch school and pay very low fees. It's just not going to happen. So, this is one of the challenges that's faced. I was reading in the newspaper the other day that a 15% cap on raising tuition and fees in Dubai. And it's really not what a lot of the schools would hope for, because not only do the schools have to remain competitive, but I really feel that all of the schools are committed to providing a world-class education for these children.
Well, do you feel, for example, in the Islamic schools, that, of course, the Muslims have big families? So if you take a working-class family, as an example, and they have 5 children, it becomes very, very expensive for them to educate their children. So do you think that they need to look at other schemes in terms of finding support for those schools as opposed to only school fees? And is there any kind of plan that you've ever heard of to move in that direction?
Well, every private school has scholarships and a number of free seats. For example, some schools will have scholarships, like you find in the U.S. perhaps, that are based upon need. Some schools have scholarships that are based upon scholastic prowess. If children, let's say, manage to achieve at a certain level, then they are able to receive certain scholarships. It varies from school to school. So that is a way to help families who need that extra assistance. Whereas in the U.S., when you talk about Islamic schools, those schools are usually linked to some sort of masjid.
Okay, sure.
And, of course, that money comes easily. You go out and you have a fundraiser.
Right, right.
But, of course, here in the private schools, you can't do that because they are privately owned, and it just doesn't work to say we're going to have a fundraiser.
But they are very profitable, aren't they?
Some are and some aren't. When you look at the overhead of any school, and I've looked at in several countries, the first thing that you have to pay, of course, you have to pay your staff. And that usually eats up a huge chunk of the tuition and fees that come in.
So let me ask you a question. Where do you see this Islamic education going in the next, let's say 2020, 2025, because this is what people are talking about in projections now. But in terms of your experience and sitting with other educators from different places in the world, where do you see this going?
Well, it can go several ways. If parents realize that they have to become partners, okay, and that varies with different groups, okay, and that's another program in and of itself. If parents will truly become partners with the school, then you will see some of the costs being able to be minimized a bit. For example, when you have mothers who go into the school and read with the children, then there's no need to have a lot of reading teacher assistants, okay? Probably when both of you were in school, I know certainly when I was in school, our mothers would go, and they would work with the slower children. They would help with the bulletin boards and all of these things, and you did not have to hire people. Additionally, it let the parents understand that they are a part of what's going on, and they took some ownership and some responsibility for educating their children.
Sure.
So to answer your question, where do I see things going? If the level of parental involvement increases, then we will see some of the fees stabilize. But if parents feel sort of like a toaster, I put bread in the toaster, I press it down, when it pops up, toast comes out. If we have that toaster mentality, I take my child, put them in the school door, I don't do anything except drive away in my car, and lo and behold, a great Muslim pops out of the door.
Yeah, it's not likely, is it?
And, well, again, it depends upon the attitude. Within any time you want change, you have to have a campaign for educating parents.
Sister, unfortunately, we've come to the end of the program now. Thank you very much for coming along. And
my pleasure.
So, Tahir, that's it. We wrap up. And thank you also, dear viewers, for watching. You've been watching Raising Children. We've been talking about Islamic schools versus public schools, or, the Islamic private schools and the benefits therefrom. We hope, inshallah, you'll join us at the same time again. This is your host, Uthman Barry. We've been talking to Tahir Khalid, Simona. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Like every sunrise that brings forth each day, brings new meaning, new hope, a new way. Such is the blessing bestowed upon us. Every hardship and heartache will pass. From the mountains to the deep blue sea, everything in perfect harmony. And as the stars fill the evening sky, without a sensing, life is passing by. So if you want a solution, my friend, seize this moment.